Today our guest is Vona Groarke, and Vona is with us because she's spending the year in New York as a fellow at the New York Public Library's Dorothy and Lewis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers, where she's working on poems that respond to the library's collection of letterpress printed contemporary poetry. Vona is rightly celebrated in Ireland and beyond as one of the finest poets of her generation. Since the publication of her debut collection, Shale, in 1994, she has amassed a body of work that covers everything from slow sets and the wonders of Skype to the 1916 Rising and the game of tennis in Irish history. In one poem titled Why I Am Not a Nature Poet, she considers the demise of her daughter's goldfish. Nemo has started swelling up, spiking pineapple fins and lying sideways like a drunk in the gutter, lipping some foul-mouthed shanty to the moon. In another, which seems fitting given that it's the week after Thanksgiving, she paints a picture of a mother overcoming familial loneliness through the acquisition of a pet pig. My mother has gone and bought herself a piglet because none of us comes to visit anymore. George has good manners and is clean in his ways. He is courtly, thoughtful, easy to amuse. Vona is a poet of remarkable range, stretching from keenly observed domestic interiors to the broad sweep of major historical events, as in Imperial Measure, which grows out of a quote from a letter by the Irish revolutionary Patrick Pearse to his mother, written during the 1916 Rising. We have plenty of the best food, all the meals as good as if served in a hotel. The dining room here is very comfortable, Pearse writes, from the General Post Office on O'Connell Street. And from there the poem opens into the examination of those momentous days in Irish history through the medium of food, as the kitchens of the metropole and imperial hotels yield up to the Irish Republic their armoury of fillet, brisket, flank, and the scene at Boland's Mill in which men's clothes were talked with the contents of flour sacks burst in the crossfire as though they were newborns, palmed and swathed, their foreheads kissed, their grip unclenched, their fists and arms first blessed and then made much of. It's this uncanny eye for exacting detail that is one of the hallmarks of Vona's work. In a poem called Flight, she describes the pellucid breastbone of a golden aureole or wren between the thumb and palm of my right hand. In Athlone's, her ode to the town right smack dab in the middle of Ireland, she pinpoints a child with a stick of rock holding up the wrapper so it crinkles into rainbows in his palm. While in Going Out, it's her daughter Eve who catches her eye, heading out on the town in her glad rags, her laugh like a floribunda rose pinned in her hair. Vona is also a poet of the here and the elsewhere, moving between England, where she teaches at the University of Manchester, in Ireland, where she still finds home, or babysitting her children via Skype during a stint teaching in the United States, where she touches their silky faces on the screen she comes to recognize, I am 3,000 miles ago, 5 hours in the red. In American J, which also takes place during one of these teaching stints, she describes a classroom in which she's trying to get the students enthused about poetic form. Next, it's an ode, she says. The news is welcomed like a bad dose of head lice. Meanwhile, outside the classroom, the election and Iraq dominate the news cycle, along with the new Hummer dealership on Silas and the pre-Thanksgiving clear-out at Kmart. While teaching the ballad, she offers news reports of Jerry Swaim plucked from his job in a Raleigh abattoir to serenade the First Lady with Rat Pack classics on his ukulele, and clippings about a preacher arrested for an international drugs deal. She wonders aloud about her relevance and more broadly the cultural relevance of poetry. I'm too old for this, she writes. I feel like some hoary, washed-up hooja on the edge of a funfair, waiting for the carousel to jolt into life, and comes back to that question we all confront at one time or another as writers, and most particularly once we start to think about our writing outside the confines of the classroom. Why do I do this? What or who is it for? It's a question she takes up again in the pocket mirror from her most recent collection, X. What is it I keep this tentative record of? For what reason do I step along high words with immediate care, or list the fanciful logic of one moment, then another, she asks, before tentatively offering what seems to me a perfect answer? Is it to do with allegiance, perhaps, with how a snowdrop keeps faith with the world, or a pocket mirror, matte on one side, is true to the life on the other? Vona's poetry is indeed a poetry of allegiance to all that makes us human, and to the wild world of the senses when the mind is awake and the best words in the best order begin to gather themselves on the tip of the tongue. It is too a poetry that again and again points its pocket mirror at the world of things, taking what might to the rest of us seem matte and flat, and offering it back to us afresh in vital, vivid colour. As she says of the local accent in her poem of that name, it is a poetry that knows what to emphasize and what to let drift away, a poetry awake to detail, like the music of a gate with raindrops on it, or a street breaking through a keyhole, or a page turning in darkness as if it had something to say. And in its wakefulness, it is a poetry that calls us to be more awake, to be more noting of the moments that make up our daily lives as they are past, passing, and to come. Born in Moss-Trim in the Irish Midlands, Vona Groarke is the author of 7 collections of poetry with the Gallery Press, most recently X and Selected Poems, which was awarded the Pigott Prize for the Best Irish Book of Poetry in 2016. Her book-length essay on art frames, 4 sides full, was also published in 2016. Her poems have appeared in The New Yorker, Ploughshares, the New York Review of Books, and the Threepenny Review, as well as several other venues. She's a senior poetry lecturer at University of Manchester in England and the former editor of Poetry Ireland Review, where among many other wonderful things, she reinvigorated the idea that a poetry review should include a substantial number of reviews. Please give a warm Trinity welcome to Vona Groarke.
Oh, thank you very much. I feel like I should just slink away after that. You don't need anything else. I think you've the introduction was poetry enough. Okay, it's lovely to be here, and thank you very much to Kieran for the invitation. And I've not been to Hartford before, so it's particularly enjoyable for me. I've been asked to read for half an hour. How does that sound? Okay, but 29 minutes too long. Some of you are thinking, I can see it written on your faces. Okay, here's what I thought I would do. So I'm going to read some poems from Selected Poems for the first third of the presentation, and then I'm going to read you some prose from that book-length essay about art frames, which I like to think is a little more interesting than it sounds, and then I'm going to read some newer poems. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start with a little poem, which is, I mean, in some ways I think every poem is an ars poetica. Every poem is a kind of declaration of the poem that you want to write, of what it is you think the business of poetry is, of what you're trying to accomplish when you finish a poem. And this one is just like an 8-line vignette that has a particular moment. So not all poems have a particular moment. Some of them have a wide time frame, but this one has a particular moment and a particular scene. And it's only after I came to New York that I realised the particular scene was probably New York at the time. I don't think I quite knew that. When all this is done, sure, if I liken you to anything, it will probably have to be the small boy on the A train with a xylophone on his lap. When the doors close, nothing is left of him but precise metallic silence where his 4 right notes have been. Now, I know that some of you are writers and some of you are studying writing, and some of you maybe are thinking of poems in various ways. And so in choosing out what poems I would read for you this afternoon, I was trying to do different things with the poems that I selected. So the poem I'm going to read now is not a poem that makes sense in a narrative sense. So it doesn't have a story to tell. It doesn't start at the beginning of the story and work its way through to the end of the story. It's not that kind of poem. It's a poem the logic of which is grounded entirely in the sound that the words make, because sound, of course, is a very important aspect of what happens in poems. They're not always trying to tell a story. If that was all they wanted to do, then they could probably do that through prose quite efficiently. But this one is working off the sound of the word that is the title of the poem. The title is bodkin, which you might know what a bodkin is. How many of you know what a bodkin is? Yeah, you see, I don't think I knew what it was when I came across the word, but I was just fascinated by the word itself. And when you hear the word bodkin, what you hear mostly are the consonants. And so what I'm trying to do is pick up the other words that have that consonantal sound and thread them together onto the word bodkin, and then to see if something can be done with that. So there is a kind of it is about something, but that aboutness is not on the surface of the poem. It's way down underneath, which I think you kind of have to excavate into, but you'll hear stuff going on. Bodkin. A word from a dream or several spiked on it like old receipts, something akin to a clavicle's bold airs, a measurement of antique land, a keepsake brooch on a quilted silk bodice, a firkin filled to the brink with mead or milk, a bobbin spinning like a back-road drunken bumpkin, borrowed half-baked prophecies in a foreign tongue, a debunked uncle's thin bloodline, a Balkan fairy story, all broken bones poked inside out, a bespoke book blacked in with Indian ink, a bobolink in a buckeye or a bare-backed oak, a barren spindle choked ankle-high with lichen, a fistful of ball bearings dropped on a bowron, body skin, kith and kin, other buckled things. A bowron, if you don't recognise that word, is an Irish handheld drum made of pigskin. You might have seen people playing when you hold it in one hand and you play it this way with the other. It makes a hell of a sound. Okay, so I lived for a couple of years down in North Carolina, and my whole family lived there then, and then moved to Manchester, and then I came back to do a little kind of visiting session there for a semester. So I was living away from my kids, and it was right at just for that semester, and it was right at the start of Skype, which is kind of, we take it for granted now, but back at the start, it was kind of extraordinary. And it was also at the time, and I don't think very many of you are going to remember this, but some of you might, Bebo, which was a precursor to Facebook, which there was some talk of reviving it, but that never happened. It kind of started and then it fizzled out, and Facebook took over, did it ever, and I think maybe the only place that Bebo now exists is in this poem, which was written then. And I have thought about changing it, because unless I explain it, nobody will know what it is. But I just think, it was written of its moment, so I shouldn't really interfere with that. So this poem is about the way that line of communication through technology seems like something that is dependable, something we can rely on. We factor it into our lives as though it were not some kind of extraordinary, magical thing that really is very fragile, very delicate in a way. And I suppose it's about the delicacy, this poem is about the delicacy of not only that particular form of communication, but maybe about all kinds of communication between humans. So I was in North Carolina, they were in Manchester. The time difference, as you probably know, is 5 hours, which is roughly the time distance between meals. So, away. I babysit by Skype, breakfast to their lunch, lunch to their dinner. I straighten uniforms, ask French, nag music practice, argue friends, trim their Bebo access. I touch their silky faces on my screen. I am 3,000 miles ago, 5 hours in the red. What would it take? One cross cyber wire, a virtual hair's breadth awry, for these synapsed hours to bloat to centuries, for my background to be rescinded to a Botticelli blue, my webcam image roughed and pearled, speaking vintage words into spindrift? Or, failing that, for me to be headlonged into light years off, to the room of an obsolete laptop where I Skype and no one answers, where I Google Earth to see if the world name checks this morning, my son's bike in the garden, my daughter's skirt on the line. I'm from the middle of Ireland, and back in the day, we didn't go foreign for holidays. We went over to the west of Ireland, which seemed the most exotic place in the world back then. And we went to a little village, and I'm one of 6, so there was 8 of us packed in the car back in the day when there weren't seatbelt regulations and so on. So 8 of us packed into the car, and we'd head over to this little 2-roomed place that we called the Chalet. And it's in a little fishing village in the west coast of Ireland called Spiddal. And Spiddal there's nothing there except a beach and a fishing pier. And the fishing pier was built as a form of relief during the Irish famine of the middle of the 19th century, when the potato crop failed and people had nothing to eat. So some public works, such as building roads, building bridges and building occasional fishing piers, were put in place so that people would have some means of feeding their families. The pier still exists. It's a huge thing. It's about 5 times the length of this room, and it's about 3 times as high. And Spiddal, this little fishing village, is in a Gaeltacht area of Ireland, which means that the main language spoken there is the Irish language. So people send their kids from outside of the Gaeltacht to the Gaeltacht to try and make them learn Irish, which is a very difficult language. And I watched them once, and one of the things that they like to do to get away from learning Irish is to go to this huge pier and throw themselves off the top of it. And it looks like great fun, and I've watched them so often, and I've thought I'd love to do it, but I'm never going to do it because I'm much too chicken, and the closest I can get to it is writing a poem that pretends that I've done it. So, Pier. It opens with a little quote from W.H. Auden from one of his sonnets from China, and the quote is, "Speak to our muscles of a need for joy. Left at the lodge and park, snout to America, stripped to togs, a shouldered towel, flip-flop over the tarmac past the gangplank rooted barge, 2 upended rowboats and trawlers biding time. Nod to a fisherman propped on a bollard, exchange the weather, climb the final steps up to the ridge, and then let fly, push wide, tuck up your knees so the blue nets hold you wide open that extra beat. Gulp cloud, fling a jet trail round your neck like a feather boa, toss every bone and sinew to the plunge. Enter the tide as if it were nothing, really nothing to do with you. Kick back, release your ankles from its coiled ropes, slit water, drag it open, catch your breath. Haul yourself up into August, do it over, raucously, head first, this time shout." And just to finish this section with a poem that Kieran mentioned in his introduction, it's a sonnet. I believe that he has his class writing forms this semester. I don't know if you've already done the sonnet, but this one is an Italian sonnet with the volta in the middle, or after the first 8 lines. Poems do try to tell some kind of truth, but it's not necessarily literal truth. And in this case, there is a surreal proposition that is surreal in one way, because people don't usually have pet pigs that they treat like children, but then not surreal in another way, because people use pets as substitutes for humans all the time. And so it's kind of bridging that thread between something that seems very practically plausible and something that has a more surreal connotation. It mentions Mass, which some of you might know, and if you don't, that's what we had to do when we were Catholics as children every Sunday. And part of it, one of the rituals of Mass, is that you have to go up through the church, up to the altar to receive Holy Communion, and then you come back. So that's why that it's mentioned here. Family. My mother has gone and bought herself a piglet because none of us comes to visit anymore. George has good manners and is clean in his ways. He's courtly, thoughtful, easy to amuse. He goes to Mass with her and sits sweetly while she trots up to receive. He doesn't stray. She has made a cot for him in the kitchen where he turns in on our old clothes cut to size. One Sunday I call on the way to somewhere else. She props him up beside me in the high chair and he fixes me with those dreary dark blue eyes. When I tell him I'm glad he's there when I can't be, he answers, "Thank you," in a voice too like my own, then bids me sit and make myself at home. Okay, so 2 years ago I published this book about art frames, which is something that I've been interested in for many years. And art frames are fascinating to me because do you know that thing that happens when you put something in a frame and it immediately seems different to how it was before you put it in a frame? Tom Waits has a line from a song that goes, "I love you, baby, and I always will, ever since I put your picture in a frame." And talking about frames seemed to me to be a very good way of talking not just about frames, but also talking about how you confer significance on things, and also about middleness. And I wrote this book at a time when I was thinking about middleness and middle age. So it seemed like all of these things seemed possible within this one trope of the frame. So what it's all in little snippets. It's not a through book like a novel. It looks like this with all separate little paragraphs. So I'm just going to give you a flavour of it by reading a few of the separate sections throughout the book. Obviously, I'm not going to read it all. Don't worry. Okay. The frame separates the artwork from the world around. What's inside is art. What's outside is not. Simple, isn't it? As if around every experience there would be some kind of transition, some way of saying, prepare yourself, there will be a crossing, so draw breath. The image proposes an imagined world. The surrounding is reality. It is where we are when we look at the image, the air we breathe, the room we stand in, the wall we're allowed to touch. The frame is the transition from imagined to real. That's a big responsibility when you think about it. No surprise then that the frame sometimes nudges towards excessive ornament, as if by being too much it can at least be sure of itself. The gap between painting and frame, like when the orchestra finishes and there's a fraction of silence before applause kicks in. When you Google image a painting, it almost always shows without a frame, as though all paintings could be equal or could be made to be. It's very disconcerting, like catching a female relative in some stage of undress. They tend to look a little sorry for themselves, a small bit abashed. If no white space cushioned the poem, its language would have to brush up against the language of the world where language buys sausages and fills insurance forms, where it writes rejections and makes empty promises, where it speaks in parliaments and fudges truths and sells cosmetic surgery and guns. And if there were no white space to mark it off, how would we know the difference? They're only little words. Even the innocent amongst them look like repeat offenders, like the lying sort. Don't play what's there, Miles Davis said. Play what's not there. Play the void. Play the white space. Play outside the frame. A parable of sorts. Imagine you have a portrait of King Charles I, that's the King of England, the one who had his head cut off. Imagine you have a portrait of King Charles I hanging in your stately halls. You're standing in front of it one morning in the mid-17th century wondering what to do. The portrait was not cheap. The cost of it and its carved gilded frame amounted to considerable outlay at the time. But the portrait was not entirely commissioned for its own sake. It was a statement of loyalty and allegiance. Look, said the portrait, my owner has spent a small fortune on me and has hung me in the most prominent position in the house. Now what does that tell you? But it's January 30th, 1649, and news has arrived that the king has been executed this morning at Whitehall. The kind of statement the painting now makes is, at best, controversial, at worst, dangerous. It's no longer just a painting, was it ever? It's a liability. But it's an expensive liability. Burning it would seem a shame, although perhaps a usefully public shame in these dangerous days. Perhaps it could be sold abroad and some of the value recouped. And so the portrait is removed and a courier found to carry it to the more expensively royalist walls in France. Of course, the courier can't be expected to bear the burden of the frame, so the portrait is relieved of its frame as the king's body was of his head. Now it's only a frame in a storeroom, propped up against a dusty, whitewashed wall. But someone, it occurs to you, might ask in a threatening voice what image the frame used to house. And so another painting is ordered, this time a landscape, trees and hills, a river signifying nothing from one edge to the other. The landscape is commissioned to fit the frame, and is hung in all its pretty innocence where the king used to preside. Sometimes the painting has the best lines, and sometimes it's the frame. During the siege of Leningrad, when German troops surrounded the city, towards the end of World War II. During the siege of Leningrad, when German troops surrounded the city, when over 1 million people died, mainly of starvation and related diseases, when people fell down dead crossing the street, when families swapped pets so as not to have to eat their own, when the city closed its ears to rumours of cannibalism, a group of Siberian cadets who had helped evacuate the museum's valuable French furniture was given a guided tour of the Hermitage. Pavel Gubchevsky, long-time tour guide at the museum, brought them round, room by room. But what they saw was not the paintings, but the frames in which the paintings had hung before the war, now safely stored elsewhere. Gubchevsky described what had been in the frames, as if the paintings were still there. That was the most curious excursion in my life, he recalled. Even the empty frames left an impression. 75 years on from then, I visit. I see a photograph of one of those rooms, frame after empty frame, maintaining its space. Something bereft about them all, but something defiant too. A room of vigilant empty frames is not a defeated room. It promises to come back to life, and it seems to be listening for the signal to do so. It forgets nothing, holds its past intact. Biding time, it waits, and then recovers itself. And just a small quote to finish on this part from the Russian writer Sinyevsky, who was sent by Stalin to a gulag because Stalin felt that something he had written in one of his novels was a slight on him. So fiction being taken very seriously. And he spent 26 years in a gulag. And when he came out, he wrote an account of it. And he said, "I walk about the house like a ghost, not the ghost that has lived here in the past, but the one that is yet to come." Okay, I have a new book coming out next year, and I thought I'd read some poems from it. It's called Double Negative, because two negatives make a positive. And so I'm interested in this idea of starting out with something that seems like it's going to be one thing, negative, as in the title, but trying to wrench it round to be something that isn't immediately suggested. One of the things that, as a teacher of creative writing, I often tell students is, forget about working with abstract nouns, because they don't mean the same thing to people, so it's awfully difficult to get them to actually communicate anything. So if I use the word fear, I might have a very particular idea of what I mean by it, but you might have a very different context for how to understand the word. So it's difficult. The words keep shifting in that way, so that they're not very effective means of transmitting anything. And yet, in this next book, I have over half the poems in the book have an abstract noun in the title, because that's the thing about being a teacher. You tell people not to do things, and then you think, well, what if we did it? What if we didn't think that was right, and what if we just did the opposite, and where would that bring us? So all the abstract nouns are negative abstract nouns, and they're all preceded in a 2-word title by the word against. So here again is this idea of opposition. So the double negative, where you're always trying to get two things to chafe against each other, to contradict each other, or maybe to agree in some sort of odd or unforeseen fashion with each other. So I'm going to read you a couple of these poems, Against Pessimism and Against Anxiety. And they're little narratives, and they're not trying to be terribly coiled or taught or curled in on themselves. They're trying to be quite open to the language that we use in everyday speech. Against Pessimism. I remember there was a big bridge with a toll, and of course I didn't have change. The river was a shadow of itself below, and a thin white cloud kept time with us to the other side. I fell asleep. Later, someone, probably Sophie, said she fell asleep, and that's as much as it amounts to when you think about it. Sophie took me to a fortune teller who said my grandma would die in a fire and would leave me everything. Both my grandmas had already died their bone-cold deaths long before. So much for fortunes, so much for fire. I don't know where Sophie is now. Back then, the future was the bridge, but somewhere it changed to the toll. You hand over coins, he hands back smaller coins. He doesn't speak, so you don't either. Just look ahead, release the brake, get underway. Against Anxiety. A cartoon rider on a horse so real it shits and stalls and rears against the rider it's been saddled with in this narrative, who wonders, of course, if he's been here before. But nobody, not the old-timer in the sun chair, nor the woman stock still in her parked car, not even the dog who stares him down, bids him time of day. The horse comes not to care, one way or the other. There will be hay, or else there won't. Either way, he's a horse still tomorrow. The rider knows nothing about tomorrow. He moves on, colour and storyline, to the next bit of road, and the next. Past fury, exhaustion and bafflement, none of which touch him, not in the least, as he drags with his ears a shaft of light from a moon he thinks is real. I suppose that's the thing about cartoons. Everyone sees the punchline coming, except who's about to get punched. Okay, Haworth is a place in North Yorkshire, north of Manchester where I live, which is where the Bronte sisters grew up, the three sisters and their brother Branwen, Charlotte, and Charlotte in particular was the focus of an exhibition that was on when I visited there with my daughter a few years ago, and the exhibition was about things that were in the house that they knew belonged to Charlotte Bronte. And amongst the things on show were articles of her underwear, which struck me as being very indecorous. Really, I don't think anybody wants their underwear to be on display to tourists, to visitors paying or otherwise. But the visit and just that sense of unseemliness, I suppose, in trying to interpret the past, and how it makes us go into places where maybe we don't belong, and makes us intrude on things that we probably should leave alone. And the fact that I was there with my daughter, who at the time was 16 or so, and was just trying to decide what she would do with her life, and after school, and what she would study and so on, and that sense of the female line, and that sense of privacy, and that sense of appropriation, all of this seemed to be in the mix in some way in this poem. On seeing Charlotte Bronte's underwear with my daughter in Haworth. With bad weather forecast and lights silting up in cramped windows, we are the only visitors. The year settles in a corner of the room, has removed its white gloves tip by tip and set to one side its summer purse of bibelots and sheen. Half term of her final year, we are sightseers intent on moors. In the morning, her wind cheater and red wellies will bestow the dust of summer festivals upon sullen, wind-soaked sheep. We will park and walk ourselves into the final cutting rain between pages of her favourite book. She wants to go all the way to Top Withens, or the house they say must have been Top Withens given its loneliness and set. But now is artefacts and souvenirs, a perfume with too much musk in it, a jar of damson jam which we won't open until past its sell-by date. We are buying the word damson, and we are buying time. Are they real, she asks me, and I watch her reckon the distance between what should and should never be seen. We have fallen short. She draws, and what she draws is rain falling slant inside the bedroom. The bed is a box of leaves and stones, and within the display case she hangs from the clothes rail little moons. On the mannequin, water lilies stand in for morning dress, but the backdrop is marbled in what looks to me like veins and archeries. But when I flick through the sketch pad in the B&B, all the pages, what is left of them, are clean. Next day she leaves it in the car. When she moves away, she will leave it again, a sketch pad with no name on it and only the faintest traces of where she made skies of darned linen and unfastened every stitch. I probably should have explained at the start of that Top Withens is the house in Wuthering Heights where Heathcliff lives, and it's very remote, and to get to it you have to walk about 2 miles through fairly unforgiving moor landscape, and in the rain I'll tell you it's 2 miles of solid muck. Okay, I'm just going to read 2 more poems. I have to read a poem about my dog, because that's what middle-aged people do. In fact, I didn't realise I had become middle-aged until I'd written a poem about my dog. And this one is in 2 parts. Well, you know, if you've had a dog or if you've had a pet, and you know the kind of stillness that they sometimes enjoy and encourage in other people, a kind of a quietness, just a sort of a time out kind of period, and it's about that. So the dog at the time was an old dog, and I had taken her over to Achill Island, which is right on the west coast of Ireland, at around about this time of year. So the days were really short, sun up at about 9:15 in the morning and sundown at about before 4 o'clock. How does that compare with here? Is that about the same?
Shorter.
It's shorter there?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right.
The sun's up about 6.
Oh, okay. I'm never up at 6, so. Okay, so it's about stillness in a way, but is on the surface it's about the dog, and then underneath that is about what it is that the dog represents in a life. The gift, I suppose, that a dog or any animal or anything that's peaceable can bring. This being still. 1. With the dog's head on my foot, asleep, it seems wrong to move. She's getting old, doddery, walks into doors and stumbles off curbs, feels her way by the edge of my voice. I have brought her to an island of cropped light and few words, her silence just as diffuse as my own. She keeps close into me. It is a small gift to the world, I reckon, this, our being still. 2. In no time, at the clatter of a winter bird, or my book falling, or the heat kicking in, she will rise to the surface of the last of day, and I will meet her milky gaze to wonder what I wanted to begin with. And just to finish, this is a poem that's in couplets, and any of us who seriously make a place for poetry in our lives at some point are going to have to answer the question. It's usually a relative who has absolutely no interest in poetry who will ask, what's a fur? What do you do with fur? What's it all about? Like, why do you bother? Which is a pretty difficult question to answer. And this poem doesn't answer it at all, but provides answers that are the wrong answers, I suppose, but maybe the right answers for this poem in particular. This poem. This is the poem that won't open no matter where you press. This is the poem that cries on street corners and plays at being lost. This is the poem arranged at a tilt so all the words slide off. This is the poem with lacquered roses closing in on themselves after dark. This is the poem that plays itself out in dives in the small hours. This poem likes to fool around in other people's cars. This poem gives away small coins and winks at strangers' kids. This is the poem that understands what it is to be a dog. This is the poem with a teensy tattoo you'll never get to see. This poem has no big plans for you, which is something as poems go. Thank you.